This is a little prayer that was written. Since we're going to be kind of looking at the Easter story in the Gospel of Mark today, I found an Easter-themed prayer from the 16th century from the Cistercian monastery in Bordeaux, France. One of the monks there wrote this in the 16th century, which would be the 1500s. So I invite you to join me in these words for our opening prayer tonight. Living God, long ago, faithful women proclaimed the good news of Jesus's resurrection, and the world was changed forever. Teach us to keep faith with them, that our witness may be as bold, our love as deep, and our faith as true. This we pray in the name of the risen Christ. Amen. One of the things I love to do with Bible studies, I always tell people sometimes come to me and say, I really struggle with my prayer life. I really struggle with how to go to God in prayer. I always tell them, you don't have to reinvent the wheel. There are people out there who have written beautiful prayers for centuries and that are very deep and meaningful. There are great collections out there that I'm happy to point you towards if you'd like to purchase them online or at a bookstore. Or also I would just recommend the Psalms, right? The Psalms were the prayer book of our ancestors, and every single emotion you can feel is kind of written into the Psalms, from joy and happiness and gladness to confusion and regret and frustration to sadness and grief and mourning. It's anger. It's all in the book of Psalms. So I also recommend that as well.
Pastor Darryl, one thank you. It's been very obvious to me this whole Bible study that whether it's been the prayer or you've really put so much prep into it, and I really appreciate it. I'm sure we all do, but I mean,
thank you, Diane. I appreciate it.
I don't take it for granted. I think it's really, really appreciated.
Thank you. I appreciate you saying so. I really enjoy teaching, and I think that's selfishly, I think that's one reason why I'm selfishly want some of us to join together in person, because I kind of miss the in-person aspect of it. But I really do enjoy teaching, and I really appreciate y'all sticking with me all this whole time. And I just want to say a word to those of you who have watched online. There are folks who have watched just about every single one online, but haven't been able to make it for whatever reason. So I appreciate them as well. So we're going to start with, if you open your Bible to chapter 14, verse 28. I neglected to point this out last time, so I want to begin here. Chapter 14, verse 28. Before the passion really kicks off, we get a very important line that will become even more important as the story progresses. Chapter 14, verse 28 of the Gospel of Mark. When they sung their hymns after the Last Supper, they sang the hymns, the psalms that are associated with the Passover. They went out to the Mount of Olives. I think I mentioned last week that the Mount of Olives and the prophet of Zechariah is the location of the battle between good and evil. In Zechariah, that's Z-E-C-H, not Zachariah, Z-A-C-H, the prophet Zechariah. In the prophet Zechariah's apocalypse, the final battle between good and evil takes place in the Mount of Olives. So we have this spiritual struggle of Christ on the Mount of Olives in the Garden of Gethsemane. It's not the crescendo military battle that Zechariah was talking about, but we have the internal spiritual struggle of Christ in the Garden of Gethsemane in the Mount of Olives. But a very important foreshadowing takes place in Mark 14:28. Jesus says to his disciples, "You will all become deserters, for it is written, I will strike the shepherd, and the shepherd will be scattered." but after I am raised up, I will go before you to Galilee. Now we have the privilege, and we have the tool of written scripture to always go back to, as this is happening in real time with all of the emotions and everything. The disciples forget this moment, and they forget this foreshadowing. But Mark, as a narrative writer and putting the gospel together, is putting this in the reader's mind before the events really escalate, because they escalate very quickly after this. So I neglected to say that last week, and I wanted to kind of circle back and lift up this foreshadowing of the gospel of Mark before things really start to take a hold. But I mentioned last week that Jesus, when Judas betrays him with a kiss, why was that kiss important? One was, we forget that Jerusalem is a town of, about 40,000 people in the ancient times. And then when Passover and the festivals would hit, it could balloon to 100,000 people with all the pilgrims coming to Jerusalem. The Roman soldier, or the temple guards, might not have ever seen Jesus before in their life. So if they just went to the Garden of Gethsemane to arrest him, they would have had no idea who to arrest. So Judas kissing Jesus has the practical application of showing the guards who to actually arrest. But then there is the double betrayal, right? There's the actual betrayal of a disciple who had been with Jesus from this journey for a long time, betraying his rabbi, betraying his teacher, betraying his Messiah. But at the same time, there's the double betrayal, in that in ancient Jewish culture, there were lots of ways to greet someone between men. There was lots of different ways for men to greet each other, from simple gestures to more intimate ones. And probably the most intimate gesture in the ancient Jewish world between men was a kiss on the cheek. And this signaled, according to Jewish custom, that you will be safe in my presence. And so that betrayal, when Judas kisses Jesus, he is not only betraying his friend, but he's also betraying his very culture as a first century Jew. He is committing, like in the classic sense of the word, a grave sin, because by kissing Jesus, he has promised Jesus that he will be safe, and immediately breaks that promise by the guards arresting him. So that's a second layer of betrayal that often doesn't get discussed when we talk about the betrayal of Jesus by Judas. Does Mark, as you've read through the gospel, does Mark tell you what happens to Judas after the betrayal? No, we never hear of Judas ever again. There are two traditions, and I don't want to spend too much time on this. I really want to get to the resurrection, the crucifixion and resurrection. But just real quick, there are two traditions. One is that Judas hung himself. That's probably the one that's most famous, is that Judas hung himself. The other one is that Judas fell off a cliff, stumbled off a cliff. Didn't throw himself off a cliff, but was on a cliff and slipped and fell off. Those are one is found in the Gospel of Matthew, and one is found in the book of Acts. And they don't tell the same version, but Mark doesn't dwell on Judas. He's not the point of the story. From now on, it is solely on Jesus, and everybody else is a periphery character, if you will. I hope you don't take offense to that term, but in the narrative sense, everyone else falls away, and the spotlight, the focus is squarely on Jesus up to this point. And what we have in the crucifixion story, really through the rest of chapter 14 and the chapter 15, is one by one, Jesus is isolated from and is abandoned by everyone. So it begins with Judas in the Garden of Gethsemane, then by Peter betraying him outside of Pilate's courthouse or Pilate's compound. Then all of the rest of the disciples abandon him. Even the women who are the bravest and the most courageous keep their distance. I want to make sure that they get their due kudos, that they do better than the men do for sure. But even they keep their distance and never say a word in advocacy or anything of Jesus. Pilate, the Roman guards mock him, the people mock him, the chief priests, the scribes, the lawyers, they condemn him. The general citizenry of Jerusalem mock him on the cross. And then ultimately on chapter 15, verse 34, we have what feels like the ultimate abandonment, which is Jesus crying out in both Hebrew and Aramaic, Eli, Eli, Sakbathani, Lema Sakbathani, which is a Eli, Eli is Aramaic, and Lema Sabachthani is Hebrew. And I mentioned last week, and I'll just say it again, when you are bilingual, sometimes when you are in high stress situations, you will speak in both languages. And so Jesus being bilingual, it is in this moment of anguish, has this jumps between the two languages kind of seamlessly in this expression of abandonment. So ultimately, we have the ultimate abandonment, the feeling of ultimate abandonment, even by God in that most extreme moment. And so, so we have this spiraling of situations with Jesus in this. So I want 1 second. I want to catch my note here real quick. I had a note written down that I want to make sure that I get to. So this downward spiral, I want to I list it out for a second as we go through, as you read through 14 and 15. Here is the list of all the people who, quote unquote, abandoned Jesus to be by himself on the cross. He is rejected. He is abandoned by his family, the Jerusalem townspeople, Peter, the rest of his disciples, the chief priest and the Sanhedrin, which is the Jerusalem council, the crowd, which was influenced by the Sanhedrin and the temple priests, those who passed by him on the cross, the two people who were crucified with him, and eventually this feeling of God abandoning him. So that's a long list of people, as intimate as his own family, as random as strangers on the street. There are people who abandon him. And ultimately what we have at the end of that story is Jesus isolated by himself on the cross, in this just horrific moment of pain and suffering, and then ultimately death. So one of the real powers, I think, of Christianity when it comes to our faith is the image of the suffering God, and that God knows what it means to suffer because of the crucifixion of Christ. and is intimately aware of our suffering, and because of that, there's great empathy from our God for our individual and our collective suffering. And the cross gets transformed from this instrument of death to this instrument of God's empathy and ultimately God's renewal, which is one of the more powerful reasons why I know I profess to be a Christian, is this sort of intimate God who understands sort of my plight in life. That means a lot to me. So yeah, so I just wanted to bring that out. A couple of things to lift up in specific. So if you go to the end of chapter 14, at the end, chapter 14, verse 72. And at that moment, the cock crowed the second time. And then Peter remembered what Jesus had said to him: before the cock crows twice, you will deny me 3 times. And he broke down and wept. There is no redemption of Peter in the Gospel of Mark. Many of us are aware of the redemption of Peter in the Gospel of John, where after the resurrection, Jesus appears to the disciples at the Sea of Galilee while they're fishing. And Jesus, the resurrected Christ, asks Peter, pulls him aside and says, "Peter, do you love me?" And Peter says, "Yes, Lord, I love you." And he asks him 3 times, "Do you love me? Do you love me? Do you love me?" And that's called the redemption of Peter. For the 3 denials, Jesus then gives him 3 opportunities to say that he loves him. Mark doesn't give you that. Again, I don't think it's necessarily because he hates Peter. It's because Peter's not the point. Peter's denial is just another person walking away from Christ in this moment. It's not that he's actually throwing shade at Peter. It's that ultimately Peter's denial is not the point of the story. Christ's crucifixion is the point of the story. The other gospel writers will embellish and bring more detail and give you other stories to go along with this. But Mark is singularly focused on Christ. And ultimately ultimately here at the end of chapter 15, we'll get the reason why. So a couple other things to kind of point out. The ultimate blasphemy that the chief priests and the scribes of the Sanhedrin lobby at Jesus in chapter 14, verse 62, the high priest asked him, "Are you the Messiah, the Son of the Blessed One?" And Jesus said, "I am. And you will see the Son of Man seated at the right hand of the power and coming with the clouds of heaven." And then the high priest tore his clothes. That is a Jewish expression of great, just like, I can't believe you did it. That's anger in the street. Like, that's a sign of just great, oh my gosh. The chief priest tears his clothes. He's so upset by it. Why do we still need more witnesses? You have heard this blasphemy. And yet, my friends, I'm telling you right now, Jesus did not blaspheme at that moment. What Jesus said was not blasphemy in the eyes of Jewish custom, because the Son of Man being Jesus claiming messiahship and being the Son of the Blessed One is not a blasphemy in ancient Israel by the chief priest. Because of Jesus's connection to the house of the line of David, because he is claiming to this kind of kinship with the Son of Man, which comes from the prophecy of Ezekiel and Daniel. There's nothing in Jesus's statement that technically is blasphemy. Now, is it extremely dangerous? Is it extremely controversial? Is it extremely a thumbing of the nose in the face of the chief priests and the temple authorities? Oh, yes. But technically, it's not blasphemy. So as the story goes, the charge of blasphemy is a false charge. So this idea that Jesus was crucified and given a criminal's death and yet was innocent is true as the way the story is presented, because the claim that presented the Sanhedrin to say he deserves death was the charge of blasphemy, but Jesus's own words are not technically blasphemous, but they are dangerous, and that obviously plays out quite literally in front of us as the story goes along. Yeah, question.
When you, I wonder where all of the people were, where he, he performed all these miracles, and then hundreds of people saw these, miracles. Where were these people?
Yeah.
Was it so far away from where he geographically was that wasn't seen, or what?
Yeah, great question, Marsha. I really appreciate you asking that. So there are two reasons why Jesus may not have had as many advocates. So let's avoid the disciples. Let's say they feared for their life so much that they were scared to stand up and try to protect him or whatever. Let's just give them a pass for a second and say, what would we do if we were in this situation, right? Many of us would cower in the face of such danger as well. But the crowds that you're talking about, you actually is a great segue to the next thing I was about to bring up, Marsha. So thanks for saying it. One, most of Jesus's public ministry took place in Galilee, which would be akin to, let's say Jerusalem is Lansing, so if Jerusalem is Lansing, Jesus's ministry took place in the Upper Peninsula. And so geographically, you would have to be motivated your family would have already had plans to come down from the Upper Peninsula to Lansing for the Passover festival. So a lot of the people that Jesus has ministered to were up in the Upper Peninsula. And let's remember, a lot of his ministry took place in Gentile areas, which would mean, like, not only did it not happen in Michigan, it happened in Wisconsin or Ohio or something like that, or Canada. Canada actually would be the better example because it was a completely different country. And so those people might not have even thought about coming down to Jerusalem for the festival, right? Because they're not even Jews. They're of a different religious background. So a lot of the people he ministered to that we've heard about up to this point are nowhere to be found. They're back home, which is hundreds of miles away.
They wouldn't know that he was going to be crucified either.
Correct.
They wouldn't know that. Yeah.
They wouldn't know that, right? And it's ancient times, news does not travel fast. And, so they would not have had an opportunity to come down. The other thing to keep in mind is Pilate's palace. Now, the best example I can give to you is, let's say we're holding a congregational meeting in Allender Common, but everybody is gathered in the sanctuary, except for the board of trustees, the board of deacons, the executive council, and the staff. And all the decisions that are being made are in Allender Common, where the trustees, the deacons, and the staff are gathered, but the congregation is in the sanctuary. Y'all would not know what was going on. The only people who would know what was going on were the people that were in Allender Common. Pilate's courthouse, or Pilate's palace courthouse or courtyard is akin to Allender Common. It's actually a very small space, and Pilate's palace, if you visit Jerusalem, is still standing, and you can actually visit the courtyard, and you'll recognize that there are probably 100 people in that courtyard at most. So the people who are yelling, "Give us Barabbas, crucify him," are probably 100 to 150 people, and they are all power brokers, all people connected to the Sanhedrin, and all people there for a direct and specific purpose. So this idea that the Jews crucified Jesus is not really a really great, there's not a lot of evidence for that instead it's a very specific group of people. Willow, come on, girl. She's right here. I think you can see her tail, right? You can see her tail. She's very much wants some attention. The people who were in the courtyard had an agenda, and they were influenced by the Sanhedrin, who very much had an agenda. And we're very powerful people. So when you read the crowds in chapter 14, verse 8, so the crowd came and began to ask Pilate for them to, according to his custom, and he asked them, "Do you want me to release the king of the Jews?" And they said, "No, give us Barabbas." And what would you have us do? Crucify him. That crucify him is not 20,000 to 70,000 Jerusalemites. That's 100 to 150 people connected to the Sanhedrin. And they have very much of an agenda. And y'all all know that it doesn't take that many people in power to keep the general populace in line. And so even if people wanted to stop the crucifixion, you know, I think they would have been really hard pressed to do so. And so this is where, and I want to move on just after this last point, but this is where Christian anti-Semitism is really a sin that I think that we need to confess and ask forgiveness for, and not move forward, because it isn't all Jews who wanted to crucify Jesus. It really is a very small select people who had an agenda and ended up crucifying him. And I think that we've done a disservice over the centuries to our Jewish kindred in that way. And I just wanted to make sure that we said that out loud. So I want to move forward very quickly because I want to get to the resurrection. So then everything that happens after this is just brutal. I mean, it's just horrific. And but there is one very sweet and tender moment of mercy that I always like to point out, which that and I don't think he gets enough. He doesn't get enough credit, and we don't lift him up enough. But in chapter 15, verse 21, and then there was a passerby from the country. Now the country is where Jesus is from. And they asked him to, and they compelled him to carry the cross. And that was Simon of Cyrene, the father of Alexander and Rufus. So one real quick note. Notice how many times in chapter 14, 15, and 16, the Mark uses these names of people who obviously were well known to the people reading the story in the first century. Like those original readers of the gospel, they know who Alexander and Rufus are. Like we don't. That would be like saying like, that was Lloyd Weiner, like, father of Greg and stuff, like, and they're members of the church. And you're like, oh yeah, I know them. These are Rufus and Alexander are members of the early church. And people reading the story in the first century go like, oh, I know Alexander and Rufus. That's so cool that his dad was there. That's what Mark is doing, and by saying these names, it's so fun. But Simon, don't read the word compelled in chapter 21 or verse 21 of 15. They compelled him, meaning that he was forced to do so. Read that really as he is doing Jesus a kindness in this moment. And it's really the only kindness that he could provide for Jesus. And so they come to this place where the cross is then erected. Just so you know, and so in ancient, all the depictions of a cross like this are incorrect. Roman crosses were T's like this, not T's like this. So when you see a cross like this with the little head area, that's Renaissance art mostly that has influenced our understanding of crucifixion. But the historical data, the archaeological data shows us that Roman crucifixes were T's like this, not T's like that. So that gives you a sense of where Jesus would have been, how Jesus would have been crucified. The other thing to keep in mind is usually crucifixions would last days. And so the fact that Jesus, dies in a matter of hours is also a kindness and a small mercy to Jesus in this moment of anguish, because most crucifixions would take 48 to 72 hours for the person to die. So they're hanging there for days. It was also an execution only for non-Romans. Romans could not be crucified. Roman citizens could not be crucified. Only non-Romans could be crucified, and they really were reserved for the most severe of criminals, terrorists, and insurrectionists. So how many of you have watched Spartacus? Maybe the old Kirk Douglas movie Spartacus. That's actually the type of person that normally would be crucified. So even Jesus's death is extreme. Under normal circumstances, a person who had done Jesus's crime of blasphemy, that would not usually dictate a crucifixion. So everything about this is extreme. So a couple other things theologically to keep in mind as you read through this story is, if you go to chapter 15, verse 33, when it was noon, darkness came over the whole land. Where have you heard darkness covering the whole land before? In the Bible. Where in the Bible do you hear the words, and darkness covered the whole land?
Genesis
1. So theologically, the crucifixion is taking creation all the way back to the very beginning. It is resetting the clock, if you will. And if you know that scripture verse in Genesis 1, it's not just that darkness covered the whole land, but it's chaos, right? And chaos is everywhere. And so the very first thing that God has to do to create is tame the chaos. The crucifixion is chaos and evil and suffering and darkness, all encapsulated into one human event. And doing so, the darkness, the eclipse that happens at the time of the resurrection, is theologically saying we're going back to the very beginning, and this is resetting the clock. If you go then to chapter 16, verse 1, it says, or verse 2, on the very first day. And what's the first thing God does? Creates light. And so now we've reset the clock on the resurrection. This is why Christians say that the resurrection is the 8th day of creation. Have you ever heard that before? The 8th day of creation, meaning that it's the start of the new creation. So think about what you've read up to this point, and starting with chapter 14. They go to the Mount of Olives, where the final battle between good and evil will be played out. Jesus goes through this horrific event. Is his whole experience, his whole bodily experience is the spiritual battle inside of himself between good and evil, righteousness and sin, and all of these things. Then he actually becomes crucified, which then is so decimating to the idea of creation that we go all the way back to the beginning. Everything up to creation is basically reset at that point. And then he is placed inside of a tomb, and for 3 days, the creation basically is in pause at that point. And then when the resurrection occurs on that very first Easter, then we restart creation when the sun rises again. And so the rolling away of the stone is like God rolling away the darkness again in Genesis. And so this parallel between Genesis 1 and Mark 15 and 16 are very closely, connected to one another. So just a couple other things before we get to the resurrection story. If you'll turn to 1542. Well, right before that, you have the mention of the women who keep their distance. And you have the same women at that moment are the same women that come to the tomb on Easter Day. But Joseph of Arimathea was a member of the Sanhedrin. He was an eyewitness to the trial, the time in Pilate's courtyard, the flogging, the suffering, the crucifixion. He witnessed it all. Nowhere is Joseph mentioned as a disciple or a follower of Jesus. He witnesses the events firsthand, with no prior knowledge of Jesus's ministry in Galilee or anything like that. And so again, he experiences this passion and is moved by it, and uses his own power and wealth to sort of give Jesus an honorable burial. Again, if Jesus's death would not have facilitated a singular tomb, usually in Roman times. Most criminals who were crucified by the Romans were buried in mass graves. So the fact that Jesus got a singular burial is 100% attributed to the power and the influence of one person, which is Joseph of Arimathea. And if you've been to Jerusalem, you know that there are 2 different sites that claim to be the burial site of Jesus. And so if you go on a tour of kind of religious sites in Jerusalem, they'll take you to both, and you get to decide which one you think it is. Also, by the way, there are 6 different Emmauses, because they have no idea where Emmaus is. So they'll take you to 6 different ones, and each one will claim to be the real, authentic, actual Emmaus. But Emmaus actually they don't know where the Emmaus is and which is. So it's always fun to get whichever tour guide you get will always take you to the real Emmaus. The other ones are taking you to the fake Emmaus, but we'll take you to the real Emmaus. I don't want to skip over this because it is the point of all of it. You know this because you've read the entire gospel. But chapter 15, verse 39 is the point. You've started with Mark 1:1, and then on chapter 15:39, the point comes full circle. So let me read you let me just read it for you one more time. This is how Mark begins his gospel. The beginning of the good news of Jesus Christ, the Son of God. At the crucifixion, when Jesus has breathed his last, you have finally someone who actually gets the point of it all. And it's not a disciple, it's not a chief priest, it's not his mother, it's a Roman centurion who, witnessing the crucifixion, proclaims in an affirmation of faith, truly, this was God's son. So Mark told you on the very first verse of the gospel what the point of the gospel was. And now here at the end of the crucifixion, we get the proclamation, the affirmation of faith of everything that Mark has presented to you up to this point. And it could not be more of an outsider than a Roman centurion who, and I think I've beat this into the ground, much like I've beat how fast Mark moves into the ground. In Mark's gospel, insiders, people who should get it, don't get it, and marginalized people and outsiders recognize Jesus for who he truly is. And much like the demons and the unclean spirits and the blind and the suffering recognize Jesus immediately for who he is, the Roman centurion has this profound, moment, and tradition has that he actually becomes a Christian and everything. We don't know who this centurion is; he's never named. But other gospels will say that it's will connect him with Jairus, but we don't know if that's actually what his name was or not. But tradition has that he becomes a Christian and becomes part of the early church. So I didn't want to leave that. So then lastly, when the women come, Joseph wraps him in a linen cloth and they put him into the tomb, and the stone is rolled against the door. And notice in this case, a lot of the imagery that you've seen is like a big opening in the front of the cave, and then the stone. And no. Like there was like a real door. So the door gets closed. So there's a tomb, and then the door gets closed, and then they roll a stone in front of the door. A lot of the artwork that we've seen is like there's a tomb, this carved out tomb. And then there's like this big hole in the front and stuff. That's, again, artists, they take a lot of liberties. It's a very small space. It's a very small space. And there's an actual door, just like a normal door. And then the stone is rolled in front of it. And so sometimes the artwork takes liberties, and I just want to make sure that you're aware of that. So then the crucifixion is over, and the story jumps 2.5 days. So sundown Friday night, nothing happens Saturday, and then we pick up the story on Sunday morning, on the first day of the week. Which here you have Mark not only resetting the calendar in terms of creation, but also resetting the calendar for the Christian calendar which Sunday morning becomes the start of the first day of the week. So Jewish custom is sundown is when day starts, the new day starts. In Christian Christian timekeeping, sunrise is when the new day starts. And so with the start of the new day comes the dawn. The dawn is a symbol of the resurrection, which is why in a church, the congregation should always face the east. So a chancel area should always be on the east side of a sanctuary so that the congregation is facing the rising sun. The rising sun, hope everyone's seeing this, the rising sun. So so that is Christian tradition, that the sanctuary should always face east. My church in San Diego, by the way, did not. We faced west for some reason, but Californians, what are you going to do? So on the first day of the week, the same women who witnessed the crucifixion come to the tomb. They're asking the question, who's going to roll away the stone? So Mark, Luke, and John do not explain how the stone is rolled away. Matthew tells you exactly how the stone is rolled away. An angel descends on the stone and then with a wave of its hand moves the stone. You can read the Easter story in Matthew, but in Matthew, an angel descends and an angel, waves it away and it rolls away. In Mark, Luke, and John, when the women arrive, the stone is already rolled away for them. In Matthew, an angel is the messenger that tells the women of Jesus's resurrection. In Luke, it's two men dressed in white who tell the women the experience of why that Jesus has been resurrected. And in John, there's no one there. Mary comes to the tomb, sees that the stone has been rolled away, that there's nobody in the tomb, and then runs back to the Peter and the disciples and says, someone's stolen the body. I say this to you to say, each gospel tells a different version of the Easter event. Collectively, that what they're talking about is that God has intervened, that God has will not allow death and evil and sin to have the last word, but their details are different. But the point is all the same, that Christ is risen, therefore the story has not concluded. Therefore, creation is reset. Therefore, we have something to do. And what do we have to do? Well, all you have to do is look at chapter 16, verse 7. And the man in white tells the women exactly what to do, which is go and tell the disciples that Peter, that Jesus is going ahead of you to Galilee, just as he told you. Where did he tell you that it was going to happen? Chapter 14, verse 28. Before all of this started, he said, but don't worry, I'll see you in Galilee. And no one remembered what he said. But you do, because you have the book in front of you. And so you can always go, oh yeah, that's what he said. He did exactly what he said he was going to do. He's a man of his word. So a couple other things just to keep in mind. The man in white Mark never says he's an angel. That's what we say. We put him as an angel, but Mark never says that he's an angel. Instead, by being dressed in white, we have two he's making a reference to two different types of people that the early Christian church, as they're reading this, will be familiar with. One is, of course, where have we seen Jesus in white already in the story? In the Transfiguration, right? So by presenting a person in white, Mark is saying this is someone who recognizes, this is a messenger from God to tell you. Now you could say, well, that messenger of God, that's an angel, but Mark never uses the word angel. Angels put different things in our heads. Renaissance art and stuff, we have a real interesting conception of angels in our mind. So I think Mark is specifically trying not to put that conception in our mind. But this is someone who recognizes who Jesus is and recognizes the plan that God has. But the other one is historical, by putting the person there who tells the women that Jesus is raised and putting him dressed in a robe in white, is what in the early church a martyr would be buried in. So in the early church, if someone was killed and deemed a martyr, their burial, the body would be wrapped and put in a white robe as they were buried. So I think there's some different levels going on here with Mark, right? Think about people reading this in the year 65, 70, 75, 80. They have seen relatives, friends, kindred, community people murdered for the faith, executed for the faith. And when they read the words, a man dressed in a white robe, not just dressed in white, right? It's not like dressed in like a fancy seersucker suit, but dressed in like a white robe, they immediately would say, oh, that's a martyr. That's someone who died for the faith. So I think that's a powerful statement for those first century readers, right? That's your kindred, your family, they were witnesses to this resurrection. I think that's really powerful. Lastly, and we're going to end with this because we're right out of time, and I'm proud of us. We got through the Gospel of Mark, everybody. Really good. If you read through your Gospel of Mark, I mentioned this before, you often will have something called the shorter ending of Mark and the longer ending of Mark. The shorter ending of Mark that says, and I'll just read it because it's one verse. And all that had been commanded them, they briefly told to those around Peter. And afterward, Jesus himself went out through them from east to west, and the sacred and perishable proclamation of eternal salvation. There's no way that our boy Mark wrote that. You've read the Gospel of Mark, and Mark has never used language like that. The first time that shows up is the 4th century. So we have manuscripts that date back to the 2nd century for the Gospel of Mark, but that verse doesn't show up to the 4th century. Someone read the Gospel of Mark and did not like the way it ended and said, you know what, I'm going to add a line. But no one, I'm telling you, there's no one worth their grain of salt in academic biblical scholarship who thinks that in any way, shape, or form, Mark actually wrote. Now, you might have like a longer ending of Mark. I would encourage you to read the other Gospels, just like the end, right? Just the Easter story or just the resurrection event in the other Gospels, and then come back and read this and tell me if this doesn't sound like a synthesis of what is written in Matthew, Luke, and John. This ending doesn't show up until about the mid-3rd century. But it's better than the other attempt. The other attempt is just get out of here with that. forget about it. Like, don't even try. Don't come with me. Don't come with me with this shorter ending of Mark. Like, good try. Whoever wrote it, I appreciate you trying. But the other one is, again, because there's no physical resurrection of Jesus in the Gospel of Mark. Later Christians wanted there to be one, and they wrote one using Matthew, Luke, and John to kind of create one. But we have no ancient manuscripts that have the Gospel of Mark having a physical bodily resurrection of Jesus and a resurrection appearance like we have in Matthew, Luke, or John. And so I'm going to leave you with this sort of like hanging question for you to chew on. Why do you think Mark didn't see a reason to give us a story about the physical appearance of a resurrected Christ in his gospel? Why did Mark not think that was important? Because all evidence shows that the story ends with the women running away from the tomb. First afraid, obviously they start telling the story, but ultimately they start off afraid. And there's no like Jesus moment with Mary in the garden where he goes, Mary, and they, and Mary goes, hey, Jesus, there's none of that. There's no road to Emmaus story. There's no great commissioning. Now go forth and baptize in my name, in the name of the God, the Father, the Son, and the Holy Spirit. There's none of that, right? There's a man in white. The women get excited. They're so like confused but thrilled. And so why did Mark do that? I just want you to wrestle with that question, because guess what? There's no answer. Like, there's no one answer to that story, that question. It is the question of our faith. Like, why? I have my idea why. I can tell you it if you want me to. Because we meet Jesus out there. You want to experience the resurrected Christ? He's out in the world. That's where we experience the resurrected Christ. He's not in the tomb. He's in Galilee. He's gone out ahead of you, and we experience him in our journey of faith. That's why I think Mark did it. But there's books, big, thick books that you can read. Next time we'll read the Gospel of John, and you'll get, not only will you get an appearance of the resurrected Christ, you'll get your most beloved version of that story with Mary in the garden and them having this great, experience. And so the later Gospels made sure that there were physical appearances of Jesus in the Gospel. But the very first one, Mark, was written in the year 65-ish. He's the very first Gospel, and he decided that I'm not going to put one in for whatever reason, but I'm thankful that he didn't. I'm also thankful for y'all. So we read the Gospel of Mark. Give yourself a round of applause. Good job, everybody. We got a couple minutes. If you got comments or thoughts, I'd love to hear them. We got a few moments. So if you need to run, by all means run. But if you got some comments, don't hesitate.
I just wanted to echo Diane's comment to you earlier, but this has been so interesting. It's just been, I've learned so much, small things that I thought, well, I never thought of that, or I've never heard that, or so I know that you put a lot of prep work into this, and I very much appreciated it. So
Thank you, Ellie.
Been very cool learning experience.
Thank you. Thank you,
Darryl.
Thank you, Mary. And thank you for the giraffe for Gloria. She loved it.
Good.
I really appreciate it. I asked Mary for a giraffe out of her Beanie Baby collection, and she found one for me. And,
Oh,
and Gloria very much appreciated it, Mary. So thank you.
That's great.
And have fun up at your cabin this weekend. Yeah. All right.
Take
Yeah.
care.
Well, everybody. Oh, Tim, did you want to say a word, Tim? I saw you take your mute off.
Well, Darryl, with the second ending, the long ending,
Yeah.
I always thought it's like the unfinished Michelangelo pieces where someone comes later and adds on to it, think they're finishing it. And I agree with you, it's so out of place. I think there's an Old Testament equivalent, if I'm not mistaken. The book of Job has like a second ending to it to make it more palatable, put a ribbon on it. And then
Right.
I felt similar about the Job ending too, that it just didn't seem to fit the whole thing.
Right. No, Tim, that's a great point. I didn't even think about Job, but you're absolutely right. The original ending of Job is Job saying, if God was here, I'd give God a piece of my mind and I'll tell him what's up. And then God shows up and says, who are you? How dare you question me? Were you there at the beginning? And that's how it ends, right? And then someone came around like a century later and said, no, we need Job to like have a better ending than that. And like they gave him the Hollywood ending, right? Where
Got
like,
rid
he
of
gets
the
another
boils
wife and he has more
and
kids and he gets his ranch back and he becomes a successful businessman again. And but no one believes that was the original ending. The original ending of Job is God telling Job, like, who are you to question me?
That's right.
oh gosh.
By the way, Job is trying to answer the question, why is there suffering in the world and why do bad things happen to good people? And God's answer in the Job is, how dare you question me? Like, that's a lot. That's a lot to chew on. That's a lot to chew on. So, all right. Well, everyone be good. I'm going to leave you with, this is how I end youth group every single time I leave youth group. Until I see you again, make good choices, know that you are powerful, and use your power for good. And that's how I end youth group every time. So there you go. That's for y'all. All right. Take care, everybody.